Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session, Cybersecurity Readiness, Key Pillars of a Secure Supply Chain. I'm Courtney Wolfe, Managing Editor at SEM Magazine, and I will be your moderator. The cybersecurity threat landscape is constantly changing. One of the best ways to mitigate this challenge is by choosing the right vendors and manufacturers within your supply chain. This is why today I am so excited that we have representatives from each link in that supply chain, so they can discuss the extensive measures they take to ensure their products are cyber secure and why a fully integrated and secure supply chain is critical to establishing a cyber hardened physical security system. And please, if anyone has any questions, submit them to the Q&A box and we will get to them at the end. So without further ado, we'll have each of our panelists introduce themselves, starting with Brian.
Hi, I'm Brian Lipscomb with Convergint Technologies, and I'm part of the Cybersecurity Services team.
I'm Wayne Dorris.
Hi, I'm Laurent Villeneuve. Go ahead, Wayne.
Sorry. I'm Wayne Dorris. I'm the Business Development Manager for Cybersecurity for the Americas for Access Communications.
Hi, I'm Laurent Villeneuve, a Product Marketing Manager at Genetec. Genetec is, if you don't know, is a global provider of unified solutions, and I've been in the cybersecurity and video team for a few years.
Thank you, Laurent. And I'm, lastly but not least, hopefully, Joueid. I represent HID here today. I am the Director for Technology Integration, primarily responsible for both the Convergint and the Genetec technical relationships. And a big thank you to the Convergint team for both hosting this event, but also allowing us to participate.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And so let's just jump right into it and ask, the big question, why is a secure supply chain so important? Brian, if you want to take this one.
Sure. Well, what we've seen in the physical security industry over the past 10 to 15 years is a transition from primarily analog systems to primarily IoT and IT-enabled systems. And, when we think back what the definition of an integrated system was 10 years ago, it meant all the components are designed to work together with one another. What integration means today is a little bit different, right? Our systems now are on the enterprise network within the client environment. They're connected to business systems, they're connected to HR databases, Active Directory, et cetera. And what we've recognized is that the level of technology in these devices and their interconnectedness are creating more vulnerabilities than what we had seen when those devices were analog. And so there are two kind of components when we set up the Supply Chain Council. There are two things that we wanted to do to make sure that we were vetting the right partners to work with. One was we wanted to understand how our partners operated their business. What were their policies and procedures for running their back of house operations, background checks, supplier vetting, subcontractor, third-party risk management, making sure that how they operated their business was secure and that it met requirements of proper security protocols within their business operations. And then secondly, we want to understand now that because all these devices are so technically complicated and incorporate pieces and parts from all over the world, how did they vet their supply chain? How did they build technology, security into their technologies and bake it in during the software development process or the product development process to ensure that at the end of the day, that the systems we're installing can have end-to-end security inclusive of cybersecurity. Our responsibility as the integrator is to bring the right product partners and the client's security protocols so that we ultimately install that physical security system, that we're not introducing more vulnerabilities into their environment because of the technologies that we're installing.
Right, absolutely. And Wayne, what are, some examples of the questions that we should be asking our providers to make sure that these products are hardened and cyber secure?
Thank you. I think we start with some of the obvious questions of where do you manufacture? In other words, when I buy your product, where is it coming from? As global manufacturers that we all are, it could come from anywhere across the globe. You'll also want to understand, do you do production yourself? Do you use contract manufacturing? Not that there's a right or wrong answer there, but you just want to understand what processes and security is involved in the manufacturing process. And then that kind of leads us to, for critical components such as chipsets and memory and other things like that, where do those components particularly come from? And NIC cards are another example of that. And then particularly if you're using a cloud or a service offering like that, what kind of data collection are you using? And what kind of my personal data will you be collecting? Where will it be stored? How do you manage the cybersecurity process for that? And then some of the other more important parts are vulnerabilities. I bought your product. How do I get advised if there's a vulnerability with your product? You should have a vulnerability policy, and that should dictate out what your response time is, what my expected response time is, if it's minor or critical. And then lastly, obviously, if you have a vulnerability and ongoing patching and updating, how do I get advised that I need to update the software or the firmware on my system? And how can I know whether that's through a platform or a piece of software natively built into the product, or if that's some other communication method. Those are kind of the basic outlines of questions you should be asking any and all manufacturers.
Yeah, those are all great. And thank you for bringing up policies. Mo, what are some standards and policies that you consider to be best practices for a secure supply chain?
Yeah, I guess just kind of carrying on from Wayne's point of view, supply chains can be large and complex, particularly when they're involving many suppliers operating at many different levels or involving many different components, right? So securing the supply chain can be hard because vulnerabilities can be inherent or they can be introduced and exploited at any particular point. So a vulnerable supply chain can also cause damage and disruption. You've only got to look at the media and kind of prolific press releases around the exposure and the brand damage that could be done as a result. But in any event, if like HID Global, you provide both software and hardware, as many companies do, you can implement a number of best practices to help them and their customers. Firstly, let me look at hardware. So in the case of hardware, really, as Wayne alluded to, it's really about understanding what needs to be protected and why. Next, I would say what you've got to look at is really get to know the supplier and what security controls have they got in place. And there's always room for improvement in that respect. Also, I would say that when you expose your security controls that you've got in place to a third party or to a customer, those two in comparison can actually be a very good metric for you to measure yourself up against. Next, what I would say would be understand the security risks posed by the supply chain. So, for example, if there are security components in that supply chain that are really at the heart of that security control system, really look at the controls around that, because I think as you look at the offering in its entirety, some of the components in that supply chain are much more sensitive to any vulnerabilities compared to others. What I also say is, carrying on from the point I made earlier, really set expectations from your suppliers, really drive them to push the bar, particularly when it comes to standards and policy, which I'll come on to. Then what I would say is really look at building assurance activities into the supply chain management, such that if there is a vulnerability that's introduced, how can we, one, control that vulnerability, but more importantly, take corrective measures and actually get us back on track. But lastly, and most importantly, what I would say is this is an iterative process. So always seek to promote, well, find improvements more so, but also promote improvements internally and also with your supply chain, your suppliers. What I also say is there's also a number of standards which companies, I would say, should adopt, particularly when it comes to protecting their customers and providing them a metric against which they can measure. So what I'll do is I'll very quickly touch on four. A point which was made earlier, information management. Information management is at the center of most of our businesses, if not all, in fact. So the first would be about establishing a comprehensive information security management system. These are systems governing the storage, the management, the protection of those information assets that can be verified by third-party audits to comply with ISO 27001. The second I would also allude to would be you would want to really know a supplier's information systems that are used to process customer data really have assurance built into them. So that's regarding security, the availability of those systems, and how the processing of that data and the integrity of that data is upheld. So if I take HID as an example, what we have actually done is we've sought to have our information systems independently examined by the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. Some of you may have also come across those. And in particular, what I would say is they define a set of internal controls known as service organization controls, and those are very good metrics to measure yourselves up against. The third, what I would say is also look at some form of examination of physical and procedural security aspects of the supply chain, particularly using documented standards and best practice. One that I would make reference to in the US is the Customs Trades Partnership Against Terrorism, more commonly known as CTPAT certification. Now, what CTPAT does, it's a collaboration of partners, and those partners actually work worldwide to come together to protect the supply chain from theft, damage, and concealment of contraband as well. And the last one I would highlight would be, as organizations move to or consume cloud services, a point that Wayne made earlier, it's absolutely imperative that those cloud services and there are best practices that are applied. So make sure that your suppliers are members of organizations that actually adhere or adopt best practice. So one that I would throw out there is one called the Cloud Security Alliance. And in particular, look for them to maybe participate in the CSA Security Trust and Assurance Registry. So what they provide is a self-assessment. It's a document where you complete to confirm adherence to cloud security best practice. And one document in particular that I would also suggest that is a good read and also a good reference point is the CSA's Consensus Assessment Initiative Questionnaire.
Thank you, Mo. Those are all really good suggestions. And then, Wayne, how do current government regulations affect the supply chain?
It has a great effect on the supply chain. In fact, as global manufacturers, it's not just one particular set of governments, right? It's not only just what the US is doing or what the EU is doing or Asia Pacific. But I'll start with some in North America because it's primarily probably a large part of our audience is probably from North America. I'll start with the NDAA or the National Defense Authorization Act. And this legislation came through as there was concerns about the cybersecurity posture of certain video surveillance manufacturers and some in telecom as well. And so last year they had actually put into effect a ban of certain manufacturers. So that certainly has an effect on a manufacturer for the way that you produce product and or services. The other one that will fall into that is TAA, the Trade Agreement Act. If you're a federal entity, the country of origin where products are coming from is also a concern, as we know the supply chain is an attack vector. And so certain places or certain contracts you may not be able to purchase if your product is coming from a certain part of the world. And then further on that is the Buy America Act, where that was passed more to say for certain stuff that they want to be made more locally. And we don't just see that here in the US, we see similar legislations across the globe in the UK and Germany. And in fact, we see like the BIS legislation for India. But that also gets us to the other big one here that has happened in North America is the DoD CMMC, or the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. And this is more onto the integrator side where, as we know, DoD, attacking DoD itself is one thing, but a lot of their breaches seem to have come from the contractor aspect. So right now, if you are a prime contractor or a subcontractor to a prime on a DoD procurement, you are having to go through this DoD CMMC process, and it has levels 1 through 5. But if I look globally, GDPR, and of course we struggle with privacy here in the States. I give an example for the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. It forced us as a manufacturer for the way that when a device boots up that we actually force the end customer to actually change the root password. And it's interesting for us because as a global manufacturer, I don't know at the time when I'm making the product where exactly it's going to go, and I don't want to have to manage having different software or firmware depending on its ultimate place that it goes. And then again, like in the UK, we've also met standards for secure by default, secure by design. So from a manufacturer's perspective, it's very difficult to have to look all across the globe, understand these legislations, and understand where you may have to make changes either in hardware or software in order to be compliant, because ultimately the end customer is going to have to be compliant, and the integrator putting this in is going to have to ensure that these products are also compliant.
Right. I imagine that's a lot to keep up with, you know, from a manufacturer's point of view. So, Laurent, would you say that products are developed with certain compliance requirements in mind, or how do you deal with that?
Yes, and I mean, I can speak for Access and HID as well, and especially in regulated markets, compliance to specific standards, industry standards, is extremely important. Let's take a data center, for example. Maintaining compliance will be mandatory just if they want to keep their own customers, let's say in the financial sector, which have very stringent requirements. So our role as a manufacturer is help those customers on their path to compliance, right? They need to use those compliance solutions. Mo quickly touched on the ISO 27001, which is a standard for information security management. This is really just a set of policies and risk management procedures that essentially helps keep sensitive information secure. So we see more and more certifications around data protection or privacy protection. Privacy protection is a very hot topic right now. So for Genetec in the video surveillance market, we have the Europrise certification, which essentially guarantees that those solutions are built with privacy by design, which is a requirement in more and more regional frameworks, right? Another big one making its way in the security industry is the UL certification that you might have seen on standard appliances in your house. For our video management system, we're complying to this at level 3. So this really gives reassurance to customers, just knowing that we're doing code and binary analysis or vulnerability assessment, pen testing, fuzz testing, you name it. Like those certifications will just say that we're doing the effort, right? And then we could go on the industry side and talk about a couple of well-known associations like ASIS or PSA or SIA. For myself, I've been part of those ASIS seminars for a couple of years, supported a few events with consultants and A&E. But I know that Wayne is actually an active member of SIA, so maybe I'll pass it back to you, Wayne. You could tell us a few things about that.
Sure. Well, I think, you know, what we're really talking about here is thought leadership. And for SIA, or the Security Industry Association, I am part of the Cybersecurity Advisory Board for that industry association. And I am also on the CTIA, the Cellular Telecommunications Industry Association. I'm also on their cybersecurity working group. And what's interesting is if we go back to government regulations, there's kind of two thoughts. Either governments will continue to push legislation onto manufacturers, or if we are as an industry going to be more proactive, perhaps we should be policing ourselves and developing standards within our own industry that we should say manufacturers have to meet certain requirements. And I've seen that work really well, particularly in the CTIA space, where in the cybersecurity working group there, they actually have a cybersecurity certification model for all of the telecom providers and the major cell phone manufacturers. Every device goes through a test before any carrier actually deploys it. And I think it's a pretty interesting route that I think that the Security Industry Association should also kind of take a look at, that either we're going to get told by various governments across the world about how to better secure our products, or we should raise the bar ourselves as an industry and force these kind of requirements on ourselves. And this way you kind of have some better negotiation when government's trying to say, you need to regulate better. Instead, we can say, look, we have this whole process for regulating ourselves better. So I really think that's one of the next steps that this industry is going to have to embrace and move forward with.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, you know, one challenge when dealing with, you know, hardening products and cybersecurity is IT policies. So Wayne, how do we interpret policies designed for IoT devices in an OT environment?
Yeah, it's real interesting. So when we look, of course, when we look at from the Genetec point of view, of course, everything can run on a Windows-based platform or a VM-based platform. But when you get to the endpoint, particularly as a physical security industry, it's very different, right? We're usually running on a Linux or an ARM architecture. And a lot of times when we get these network requirements, they are based more on the Windows or the more common operating system. And so what the challenge is that and customers have to really do is, whether it's IoT or OT, they have to develop their own security baseline and hardening baseline based on what these products can do. And a lot of times on the cyber side of their team, they're not going to understand these products. So it's going to behoove the customer to have a better understanding to say, these are the capabilities that do lie in the product. For instance, if it supports encryption like HTTPS or 802.1x, other things like that, SRTP, these are things that you can say as part of my regular policy. This matches up with my governance policy. I require encryption. I may have legislation from, say, PCI that mandates that, but I can also follow that same guideline for my physical security and deploy that across it. So it's really taking what the actual endpoint can do and marrying that up with your actual IT policy and understand, where do we have risks, where do we have gaps, and what can I do to mitigate these in the meantime if this device, say, doesn't support two-factor authentication, right? What other mitigation can I put in place to help protect it? Something we would see more standard on the IT side of the house. So it's a bit of work, but I think it's definitely well worth it to help secure our endpoint devices on all of these networks.
Absolutely. And Laurent, can you kind of touch on why certification management is such a critical component of a secure installation?
Yeah, absolutely. So certificate-based authentication, if I could be a bit more specific, it's really becoming a core pillar of for our customer deployments, both on the video and access control sides. I don't want to get too technical here, but with a unified solution, you need to manage that centrally, right? And the security of the devices needs to be managed end to end. So from the device, for example, the camera, all the way to the client or the workstation. For the VMS, this allows to check that devices that are connected to the network are only those that are authorized. And the latest and greatest, I would say, for this is what Wayne just mentioned, the Secure Real-Time Protocol, or SRTP. This is allowing us to encrypt video end-to-end in our platform from with cameras from vendors such as Axis. But there's also the access control part, which I'm a bit less familiar with. And I know Mo knows a thing or two about that. So maybe, Mohammed, I'll let you talk about this part for access control.
Thanks, Laurent. So I think the one thing I'm a great fan of is Genetec's security of security notion, right? I think which was fairly niche in the market, but it also goes back to what Wayne mentioned earlier. It's security by default or security by design. I think it's none more apparent than when you're delivering hardware, it's absolutely apparent and integral that we've got to make sure that those devices can be trusted. Now, at the heart of this, we're talking about digital certificates, right? some of us will call them X509 certs. Now, we're seeing a real proliferation of digital certificates as organizations move to leverage edge or IoT devices or services. Now, typically by applying a digital certificate to the hardware, that actually serves to vouch for the hardware's origin and identity. But in addition to that, it also lends themselves to a variety of uses, including identifying legitimate devices that are in the field, but also protecting against malicious communication and rogue firmware perhaps being loaded in on those devices. So what I would say is when you've got digital certificates in that way, such a key component of the trust model, I think what you've really got to make sure, there are three pillars that we would really urge organizations to consider. I guess that from the, in terms of the life cycle, looking at the first phase, the issuance. So when you, prior to issuing a digital certificate, you've got to make sure that you are, you have a high degree of assurance on the endpoint on which that device is being issued. And that stands, generally speaking, whether we're talking about users or devices in general. So we've got to make sure that the integrity of that issuance model, because if we don't make sure that that's upheld, that effectively the entire public key infrastructure and the key management systems, they collapse around us. The second part, I would say that once those digital certificates are issued, we need a very distributed mechanism for validating those certificates, allowing organizations to be able to ensure that those certificates are valid at any point in time. So there are common protocols around doing this. OCSP is one, the other one, SCVP. So both of these are well-developed protocols and standards, and I would encourage you to kind of look into those if you are not already using those. The other one I would say is every digital certificate reaches its end-of-life point. Now, what we've got to do is make sure that we have a very comprehensive mechanism of revoking those certificates, but also making sure that once a certificate has been revoked, for whatever reason, it may be intentional or unintentional consequences, but it's absolutely imperative that once that digital certificate is issued, we have a framework for being able to completely remove and omit that digital identity from our circle of trust. Only then can we make sure that the integrity of that trust model is maintained. Courtney?
Sorry, but another question for you, Mo, is are these hardening guides developed by manufacturers truly enough to provide cybersecurity?
Well, what we have at HID have done, we've proactively worked with the partner community, right, to employ best practices and provide guidance on how to harden integration. Now, I wouldn't say hardening stops, nor is it isolated to a particular component in the ecosystem. But what we've done is we've developed a very comprehensive set of hardening guides, particularly when it comes to our Mercury controller product line. So in the case of Mercury, what we do is we do provide the likes of Genetec a hardening guide. And what this in essence does, it allows the end users themselves to actually take a detailed and a very pragmatic approach to how they can secure and maintain the integrity of those devices. What is interesting is that in the course of hardening, we actually provide at least three different suggestions depending on the protection level that's sought. Because after all, whilst we can argue that most organizations are the same, we do have different types of organizations that function at different security levels. And it's important that we are cognizant of that and respect those as well. But in essence, what we do is we provide a basic hardening level, an intermediate hardening level, but also an enterprise level hardening level. So for example, in the basic level, what we would suggest is that organizations place the controller on a private network, secure enclosure, they update the firmware, they enable HTTPS, as has been mentioned before, but also, as Wayne mentioned, reset default credentials. That's the kind of the 101 principle. In the enterprise level, we also suggest a few additional steps. So for example, only authorize a finite list of authorized hosts to be able to talk inbound to to those panels. We also suggest you disable web, discovery, and SNMP services. Maybe also extend that and also disable USB and SD ports as well. Then there is the end-to-end encryption and authentication. So enable aspects like AES and TLS has been mentioned. Another interesting point to mention would be that rather than provide our partners like Genetec with just an SDK and an API, what we really seek to do is actually challenge them. And that's important here, right? Because we can provide Genetec some guidelines, but what's important is we allow Genetec to basically innovate. So where they see room for improvement and layer that hardening, by all means, we encourage that.
And, switching over to look at integration, how do you as manufacturers ensure interoperability between your systems? Laurent, do you want to take this one?
Sure, Courtney. So vetting the integration between product partners and our security platform is really one of the core pillars of our product development. So from a software platform perspective, our device integration team plays a really big role in there, just making sure that every single link in our ecosystem is secure. So for us, it's vetting every partner integration to make sure that not only we get the most out of every single device, but also that, of course, cybersecurity stays top of mind with every single firmware update and software update on our side. So with this dedicated team that's working very closely with partners such as Axis and HID, it's really helping us developing and maintaining that interoperability with cybersecurity, again, always top of mind. So we're working off a fully open architecture platform here, right? So this creates great challenges, but also great opportunity to work more closely with those partners. And I think I mentioned earlier, this needs to be a common mindset. And as Mo also said, it's not just working off the SDK or API, it's actually getting more information, guidelines from our partners and developing better integrations, right? So we have many really good initiatives in progress, which is aiming at making it easier for our customers to manage the security of those devices. I mentioned end-to-end security standards such as SRTP, but also pulling in more information like firmware updates, right? And ensuring a secure connection before we start sending security or metadata in the system. So I think, yeah, interoperability really goes hand in hand with cybersecurity. We have to work together on this.
Right, and that teamwork is so important. So what is the role of each party in secure integration?
I would say for the partners here, it can't be fully secure if it isn't fully baked in, and we have to make sure that we get to that ultimate goal with cybersecurity by default. So it requires investment by both parties to support the latest standards. But for end-to-end security, for example, again, end-to-end camera to client security in the VMS, we are collaborating on supporting those latest standards and going beyond that. I just mentioned like managing the security of every single device. If you have a platform with thousands of cameras from different models, different vendors, you're dealing with so many passwords for every single device and firmware updates. So a big focus for us is to give more visibility to our end users on that whole process and automate a big part of it. So we have now the firmware and password management tools that help centralize all of this. And also giving more visibility, I could talk a bit about the security and maintenance dashboard that we now offer to the end user, where they have a checklist and they can really keep track of their security score. So this helps at the very early hardening stage of deployment, but also the later kind of device level maintenance stage. So I think, again, we mentioned it a few times, working with our tech partners for secure integrations, it's not only in the beginning, connecting to the camera, but also the maintenance aspect of it, and just keeping that full system secure and up to date.
Right. And Brian, how can end users help drive the demand for more secure installed systems?
Well, I think what you've heard from HID and Genetec and Axis so far is that they take security very seriously. They build lots of security technologies into their products, and the capabilities are there. The component that creates the delivery of security is actually the combination of both the product, the integrator being Convergint, and the end user and their policies and procedures. So while all those capabilities are inherent within the technology, we need to make sure that we take and we implement the security of those devices within the integrated system. And that can only be done by an informed design, including the client's IT departments, where we're taking a look at what their policies are, what the procedures are, and all the things, as Wayne mentioned. A lot of times these policies and procedures are built to address IT vulnerabilities or IT systems, and they don't perfectly map across to operational technology. So, an important step in that process is for us to get early visibility into what IT policies or procedures are, so we can map those policies across in an operational technology environment to deliver a security that's desired, that's similar to the IT profile. So engaging the IT department early in the process gives us that understanding. And then, the actual impetus to get security delivered in that is for the clients to incorporate that into their specifications. It has to be a requirement that is driven and comes from the client, because it's not a natural progression for the integrator to just guess at IT policy and apply hardening. We need to actually be driven and prompted by the customer to drive those requirements into their specifications, into their RFPs, so that we are looking at the holistic delivery of the security system from the time that we start planning the design. And again goes back to the reason why we established a Secure Supply Chain Council, is to make sure that we're working with product partners that have interoperability that Laurent just explained, but also have the ability to work and apply security controls that are being requested and required of our clients.
Right. And, switching gears and looking at life cycle management, how can clients ensure that their systems are maintained in a cyber secure manner? Brian, if you want to take this one too.
Sure. So as I just explained, it starts at the design, in the design phase, where we're looking at the products that are available in the market and making sure that we're selecting products that have that end-to-end cybersecurity capabilities built into them. Again, it's introducing the policies and procedures for the client and making sure that we're applying those requirements to the system design. Then through the installation process, ensuring that there's an auditing and an auditing process that shows and demonstrates that those systems have been installed according to the specifications and policies. And then finally, the lifecycle management, the ongoing maintenance of those devices is critically important. A lot of times security systems have traditionally been treated as a set and forget kind of technology. Once it's installed, once it's deployed, it kind of just operates on its own and it lives in its own environment. And it's not given that treatment of keeping things maintained. But similar to like a smartphone, for example, when software updates come out on that smartphone, it generally does three things. Number one, it fixes bugs and glitches. Two, it provides new capabilities and new features that the software, improvements in the software. And three, it patches vulnerabilities that have been discovered in that software. And so what the security system has the exact same philosophy. It has software, it has firmware, and it resides on the operating systems, it resides on the endpoints, and all of those technologies need to have their software and firmware updated on a regular basis so that you fix those bugs and glitches, you get the new capabilities and features of that software, and you patch any vulnerabilities. So, and on an ongoing basis, it's really important that a customer incorporates a password and patch management program into their devices. It's a very inexpensive way to keep up to 80% of the security vulnerabilities mitigated simply through applying a password and patch management program. But traditionally what we've seen is that security systems operate in a capital expenditure model rather than an operational expenditure model. And what that means is that we need to start carving out a little bit of budget on the back end of the installation process to cover the cost of software support agreements, password and patch management programs, and those kind of things to keep those vulnerabilities mitigated on an ongoing basis.
So true. And as we're, you have something you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add just two additional points. I think just to re-emphasize Brian's point there. So I think from the perspective of software development product lifecycle, I think that the two fundamental aspects I would urge the audience to kind of consider. I think the first one being is how the secure development process starts, or more importantly, a security development lifecycle, more often known as just SDL. So these are just practices that support security assurance and compliance requirements during the engineering build itself. I think the other part being, as Brian indicated there, Courtney, is it's secure when we ship, but is that security maintained? And more importantly, we've got to be better equipped to actually deal with incident responses that actually occur post-delivery. So I think what we've got to say is a lot of organizations should really look at developing what we call a product security incident response. So what this effectively is a policy. It's how you respond, handle potential or confirmed vulnerabilities. And more importantly, it defines the entire life cycle through the testing. It talks about the assignment of what we call a security incident response team. They own the problem, and they're also tasked with keeping others updated with progress. So it's owning the problem and then coming out of the other end with a conclusion. But more importantly, it's a communication plan to the customers and affected partners as well. Thanks, Courtney.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I just want to remind everyone, as we're starting to near the end of our session, please submit any questions that you have into our Q&A so our presenters can answer them at the end. And here's a question for Wayne. So the people side of systems management is often referred to as the human firewall. So how important is it to train users and administrators?
It's really the one of the biggest keys to keeping your network secure. It's often, you know, one that's highly overlooked in the fact that we like to throw money and technology at things to automate and fix things, but ultimately it's the user that has to keep up with the password management, like Brian talked about, and it gets more importantly decided on that it's not only just human users, but it's also the endpoint entities that are also have to have usernames and passwords also changed as well. But a lot of it is on the basic training of, oh, I shouldn't be clicking on this email. I can set up all of these great systems to help protect my environment, like my firewall. But if I can get just an end customer to click on something, even if it's just it could be something stupid that they click on, and now all of a sudden an attacker already has gotten through everything, even though you have all of these advanced designs. But it's very important to also look at that as privileged access, particularly with administrators that know who has those privileges. And also it's important if you have techs that have those privileges, if they've leaved or swapped or gone on to a different role, you're going to want to change and rotate those credentials. A lot of times we see where people have gotten through using an administrator that a technician may have had from years ago, and that was still in the system. So training the human firewall is, of course, the most important part. And if you can get that part trained well, you'll have a real secure network, and your whole organization will be up to at a much better level.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Thank you. And Laurent, what is the single best way, in your opinion, to minimize the risk of a cyber attack via the physical security system?
That's a good one. I would actually challenge that thought there's actually no silver bullet to cybersecurity. I think my panelists would agree on that. So what I would suggest here is defense in depth, right? So perimeter defense is a thing of the past. For unified security systems, that means securing your hardware, making sure every device connects and communicates using secure protocols, encrypting data pretty much anywhere, wherever it makes sense. So for me, we can't really put the finger on a single thing. It's more of a grand ensemble of tools, features, and processes, right? So things you may not be thinking about that goes way beyond data encryption and strong passwords is, I think Brian mentioned this at the beginning, having visibility on all assets and data processing operations. Because if you don't know what to protect, it's a pretty bad start. So a crucial part of the risk mitigation strategy also is to keep everything current and up to date, right? So a dynamic security assessment of that deployment can really help you keeping track of what's left to do or what's changed in your system, how your security posture is going. So you can be thinking about connecting with maintenance services with a bit of automation, again, to keep track of all software and firmware updates. But beyond this, and even more important, we talked about it a bit, the human aspect, right? So general cyber hygiene, because all of this that I mentioned before won't matter if people start sharing passwords or clicking on any random link, capturing video walls with their personal phones. So raising awareness on the risk of cyber attacks is good, but continuous education on system usage, how to recognize phishing attempts, or how to properly safeguard your credentials, or which devices you shouldn't use in the work environment. So we've done a few campaigns even here at Genetec in our offices about best IT practices, and I think that needs to be done by the SI, by the end user, to all the workforce. And password hygiene, security measures, that needs to be embedded in the system. It's now very common to actually see those requirements as part of data protection frameworks, such as the California CCPA or Europe's GDPR. They're really enforcing that you have strong identity management or access to those systems. So we're really quickly moving to an identity-based world, right? It comes down to centralizing the identity management, where you don't have to manage user permissions across multiple systems. So keeping check on all of this, making sure that people only have access to what they need and that they know exactly how to use those things.
Right. Thank you. And Brian, do you have anything that you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that happens when we start talking and using the word cyber is that it gets very confusing and sounds super complicated. And the thing that I want to emphasize and reinforce to physical security systems operators and users is that really very simple technology, best practices that are common across all IT systems in the form of password and patch management on all your devices really is the key to securing your systems. It's not a complex, lots of IT jargon with, very long words with long definitions that, make all of our heads spin. It's actually taking very simple, practical solutions and putting them in place with a password and patch management program. As I mentioned, that mitigates up to 80% of the risk in that environment. And I think we need to, in some ways, just really simplify that conversation and take the simple, easy steps towards security, and that will really help mitigate the vulnerabilities of the physical security system from a cyber side.
Absolutely. And we're officially on to our Q&A portion of the panel. So everyone, please hurry and submit your questions, and I'll dig right into the ones we already have. So to start, does working from home increase or decrease cyber vulnerabilities? And Mo, do you want to take this one?
Well, I think when we are working from home typically, and it's interesting because at HID we have a dedicated business unit that deals specifically with remote access. And remote access is a very important framework for making sure that employees can connect into services and systems. I think there is the risk, because I believe that when we are remote, perhaps we don't, as Laurent mentioned, social engineering is a fact of life today. We see it in multiple facets. We've heard instances, for example, whereby, organizations get emails sent out, please click on this, it's HR related, etc. Those types of situations, if you were in the office, for example, just wouldn't occur, because typically, if HR emails coming out, you would know about it, or you'd bump into HR representative at the water cooler or what have you. So the risks are a lot more apparent. I think more importantly, when we are effectively working from home, I believe that some people might feel they're a bit more isolated. As Laurent mentioned, as Brian mentioned, education really is the key. I think that policy applies regardless. It's not about just that perimeter security we talked about. We're very much operating in a virtual perimeter, and that virtual perimeter all of a sudden now extends to the endpoints into our homes and typically stops at our laptops, but perhaps even beyond that. And again, it's not just about the devices we use, it's about smartphones as well. So I think I can't emphasize enough the importance of processes, education, creating awareness, and more importantly, making sure that the right systems are in place, not only to mitigate, but also response. And again, as I mentioned before, incident response is very important in this, because if it does occur, getting back to a sound point is very important.
If I can add to this, just very quickly, like confinement, of course, means that a lot of people are working from home, and organizations are doing their best to support that migration. So we're seeing lots of devices being exposed to remote accessibility. I think it's right around 50% increase. And I don't want to throw in too many numbers here, but it's something like a crazy 4,000% increase in ransomware emails. So attackers are taking this opportunity to go digital and all in trying to get into the systems and steal some data. So we need to, I don't think it's that we're more at risk, but the risk is very different. It's changing so fast right now with this new reality. So I think we just have to kind of, again, refocus our layers of defenses.
Right. And Wayne, here's a question for you. Based on your experience, are there a lot of companies that may be vulnerable to cyber attacks today that could be aided by Convergint?
Well, certainly. I think that when we look at just as an extension of what we're talking about, we've seen dramatic increase in cyber attacks. In fact, in March, I sat on a different conference where we received statistics from the FBI's Cybersecurity Center, and they had the highest amount of DDoS attacks in the history of the internet just in March. So I would say that healthcare is primarily under attack. We've seen that already. In fact, I did a presentation for healthcare about a month ago, and already ransomware was up 350% just in that particular sector. And it actually has the highest cost per breach in the US right now. The second one is critical infrastructure. Of course, anything to do with energy or power, things like that. Banking, of course, is another critical sector. And one that right now is also getting far more attention thanks to this is, of course, schools, right? Because everybody's homeschooling their kids themselves, but there's still some places are doing a hybrid model, and that again is schools are another one that are highly under attack. So definitely there are plenty of customers out there that could use a qualified vendor such as Convergint to help ensure that you can put together all this together for you.
Yeah, thank you. And another question we got was, what about insider threats? Is there anything physical security operators can do to prevent or help investigate insider threats? And does anyone want to take that one?
Well,
Yeah, I can
sure.
take a stab at it.
Go ahead, Laurent.
Yeah, I think operators can in part help, or they can be part of the problem, right? It really depends on the education again here. But I think implementing, you might have heard the CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability protection of your data. I think the integrity protection of data is becoming really important to prevent that sort of attack. So just ensuring that your video is watermarked, for example, with a visual stamp of who's actually monitoring the system will really help prevent that kind of insider leak. But also, it's not so much the operator that would be in charge of this, but just making sure that they only have access to the tasks that they need to perform their work. They shouldn't have access to, for example, all of the private data collected by the system. That's really going to help reduce the risk of insider attacks. And if you can anonymize portions of your data as well, for example, masking the identity of people on video surveillance, that can greatly help too, because if they can see less, then there's less potential of leakage. And I think, Wayne, you had something to add.
Yeah, I actually look at this question from a bit different perspective, in the fact that we have cybersecurity in their SOC usually, and we have physical security in their SOC, right? So a lot of times we're seeing a convergence where they're trying to push so that you can share information. Attacks happen, of course, across the network, but a lot of that information can be helpful to know what's happening on the physical side too. For instance, we had a customer that was in the energy space, and they had a substation in the middle of nowhere, and they had physically gone in, and the only thing that had happened was they had lost some tools. Well, they checked everything, made note of it, and closed it back up. It was odd that like a month later, the cyber guys were going, hey, we've had this infection on our network, and it seems to have originated from this substation. So actually, in that case, the attack was dual noted, that they had gone in, taken some tools, but they had also had access to IT equipment. And that shows sharing that information of physical security and cybersecurity has to go together. And definitely when you combine those, it helps with also from the insider's perspective, because you don't just have outside threats, you have inside threats. So the two departments have to work hand in hand.
Great, thank you, Wayne.
Just one quick comment on the back of that, Courtney. I think one of the things that HID is seeing is that there are a lot of shifts happening in the access control world, which I believe will bring us a lot of benefit in addressing that insider threat. So we've seen a lot of drive regarding using the smartphone for mobile access. That definitely allows us to kind of get a lot more visibility in terms of the user's interaction with the building. And in particular, using cloud as a framework, as well, as I mentioned earlier. But the last thing I would say is there's a lot of artificial intelligence and machine learning now being done and overlaid on top of access control, which can really allow us to mine data and really establish any anomalies that actually arise in the system that we need to effectively flag up for investigation.
Got it. Well, thank you so much, Mo. I think we're officially out of time for today, but this was a great discussion. Thank you to all of our panelists so much for sharing your expertise, and any questions that we weren't able to answer today, Brian has personally promised that he will get answers to you. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.